I was just looking at the end of Seminar 20 and recalling how we ended our series on Seminar 20, which is precisely where Seminar 20 ends in the English translation. The words, final words that Lacan speaks on June 26, 1973, in his final lesson of Seminar 20 are these: to know what your partner will do is not a proof of love. And you'll recall how we ended our series on Seminar 20. What do we call knowledge of what your partner will do? Of what is it proof? It is not proof of love. It is a testament to hate. This is what it means to hate one's partner. Enunciated knowledge, linguistified, enciphered knowledge of what the other will do. Enunciated knowledge of this sort is akin to hate, not love. If this is true, if enunciated knowledge is akin to hate, as we concluded our series on Seminar 20, I want to start this lecture by suggesting that the imaginary narcissistic love that we were just talking about in the previous lecture, it's a lot like fear. If enunciated knowledge looks like hate, narcissistic love starts to look a lot like fear in Seminar 21. Now, why do I say this? Because like fear, which always takes its bearings from the object of fear, and thus cannot help but index it with every flight, imaginary love cannot elude the impossible sexual real designated by its flight from possibility to contingency to necessity, just as we were discussing in the last lecture. So note this, it's a stone-cold piece of Heidegger. You heard me mention that Lacan's line of inquiry looks a bit like hermeneutic phenomenology. When I say hermeneutic phenomenology, I mean 1920s Heidegger, the iconic text of which is Being and Time, and one of the iconic moments in that text is his analysis of fear. Fear, for Heidegger, always takes its bearing from the object of fear. Why? Because it always moves us precisely in the opposite direction of that object, and thus takes its orientation from the object of fear. Just think about this very directly. What are you afraid of? Spiders? Bears? Heights? If you're afraid of spiders, let's just say, when you encounter a spider, you move in the opposite direction of it. You move away from it. Your entire mode of being in the world is now oriented around your object of fear. Yes, you are engaged in flight. Yes, your fear has put you on the move in a certain direction. Heidegger's insight is that the direction or orientation or bearing of your course through the world is now an index of the object you flee. And what I'm telling you is that Lacan has a very similar line of thought working when he's defining narcissistic imaginary love. It tries to elude the sexual real, a sexual real that is inadvertently, as a result, designated by this effort, this flight from possibility to contingency to necessity. It always functions as an index of the impossible from which it takes its bearing. Now, you can take these 3 points, possible, contingent, and necessary, and you can establish a line that connects those dots, extending all the way to the horizon where oneness is promised. But note, That line that you just made extending toward the horizon of oneness by connecting the dots of possibility, contingency, and necessity, that motherfucker also points in the opposite direction. It points in the other direction, back toward that which narcissistic love attempts to leave behind, namely, the impossibility of a sexual relationship. Make no mistake, my friends, when it comes to Hallmark cards, every erasure leaves a smudge, a smear, a trace of the sexual. And every smudge, smear, and trace of the sexual is a clue toward its rediscovery. Let me explain what I'm up to here. You see, to expect love to occur without any smudges, as Lacan so well puts it in these chapters in Seminar 21, to expect love to occur without any smudges is to predestine its return to the constitutive smudge of human togetherness itself, castration. At some level, this is all I've been talking about. This is everything that we've been discussing in recent series of lectures on Lacan. It's fundamentally about castration. To expect love to occur without smudges is to return us to this castrative, constitutive smudge of human togetherness. And note, not with any amount of mystic testimony or saintly laughter. Nah, man. The return that we mark in our effort to remove those smudges, it leaves us with a tragic sense of what Lacan in Seminar 21 calls finality. Indeed, as he laments at the end of chapter 4, it leaves us in a state of what is called a pure failure. When you try to remove the smudges in that Hallmark card, you will be left in what is called a pure failure. Which brings us to analytic theory and technique. Rescuing that constitutive smudge, castration, from the jaws of pure failure and restoring it as a cause of mystic testimony and saintly laughter, this is exactly what Lacanian psychoanalysis is designed to do. It is designed to rescue castration from the jaws of failure and restore it as a cause for mystic testimony and saintly laughter. And again, all by way of love. Not in the profound sense of giving what you don't have, but in the narcissistic, naive sense of an imaginary, phantasmatic effort to fuse with someone else, promising uteromorphic experiences of wholeness, union, completion, consistency, singularity, and again, they all say the same thing, oneness with another. I can't emphasize this enough, if only because it is such a central feature of Lacan's teaching at this point. It is by way of narcissistic love, not by going around it, but by going through it, that analytic theory and technique rediscovers and ultimately recuperates for all who walk its paths the very thing that makes the non-duped le nom du père. You see how this is working out? Let me see if we can put a sharper point on this one. Yes, these non-dupes mistake the impossibility of oneness for the possibility turned contingency turned necessity of its realization. It's true. They do fuck that up. And yes, their tireless efforts to achieve oneness with themselves by way of oneness with others always inevitably crashes against the rocks of this impossibility that they have mistook for a fucking necessity. But let's be clear. These rocks of impossibility against which love boats have been crashing from the start, they sit atop a certain bedrock, which is the bedrock of castration. Again, just listen carefully to the title of Seminar 21, Le Nom du Père. It's right there for you. Le Nom du Père when it comes to Le Nom du Père. The non-duped they make a mistake, they go astray precisely when it comes to the no of the Father, by which Lacan here means castrative logic. This is how the non-duped is that they have a mistaken relation with le nom du Père. Drill down on this bedrock of castration as much as you like. It's still there. But don't spend too much time in the hole you just dug, because what's new here in Lacan's 1970s thought, and what really merits our attention, is the line of inquiry that he is advocating for analytic theory and technique. He's been at it for a while. He is still at it in chapters 4 through 6 of Seminar 21. Again, let me lay it out for you one more time. It's by way of narcissistic love, not by going around it, that we rediscover the impossibility of anything like a sexual relationship. You don't believe me? Let me recall a few key passages to illustrate this line of inquiry. Passages you've read before, passages that if you attended our series in the past year, you've almost certainly heard me discuss before. The first, and one of my favorites, comes to us at the start of Seminar 20. I began this lecture at the end of Seminar 20. Here we now arrive at the start. Page 6. You probably already know the passage I'm about to read to you. Seminar 20, page 6. Check it out. Analysis demonstrates that love, in its essence, is narcissistic, Lacan says. Love is impotent, though mutual, because it is not aware that it is but the desire to be one, which leads us to the impossibility of establishing the relationship between them two. The relationship between them two what? Them two sexes. Second passage I want to call your attention to. It comes to us in television, and I'm reading from the text that constituted our recent series on television. If you've got the text in front of you, it's on page 30, and you've almost certainly heard this one from me before. But note, it's precisely the same line of inquiry that you just heard Lacan articulate in Seminar 20. Here it is. The sexual impasse exudes the fictions that rationalize the impossible within which it originates. I don't say they're imagined. Like Freud, I read them as the invitation to the real that underwrites them. Note how he is advising us to think. Narcissistic love, in its phantasmatic quest for oneness with another, and by extension, evidence of a sexual rapport, it may look like an abandonment and avoidance of impossibility. here the impossibility of fusion with another. But this is in fact precisely where narcissistic love invites us to return, even where it leads us. It is via this thing that is by its nature senseless that the real enters the world of man, Lacan goes on to say in television. The key word here, again, is via, through, by way of. It is by way of narcissistic love that the impossible finds us, and that we, in turn, can find it. And all the more so when these discoveries occur in analytic sessions. So let's ask the question one more time. What exactly is analytic discourse? Here we go. What is it? Can we finally just say what this thing is? It's been on Lacan's mind since the late 1960s. It's the thing that he believes he is adding fundamentally to psychoanalytic theory and technique. For Lacan, at this point, in the winter of 1973, 1974, it's a network of pathways. That's what the analytic discourse is. It's a fucking trail map. It is a network of pathways by which to travel through fantasies of narcissistic love, ensconced in fictions of possible, contingent, and even necessary oneness. We travel through all that shit toward not fictions, but facticities. Facticities of speaking being. Facticities of speaking being that we access through narcissistic love. Through fiction, we access fact. Facticities of speaking being whose origin is real, whose modality is the impossible, and whose operational result is not oneness, but triplicity. From the imaginary to the real by way of the symbolic, this is what the psychoanalytic discourse affords. Note, I want to just get more and more simple with this. Don't try and make this more complicated than it actually is. There are really just four moving parts to the argument. First, the analytic discourse is a matheme, you've heard me say. Why? Because it's structured around a certain impasse, an impotentiality turned impossibility, known as castration, that brings us to the doorstep of the real. What is that threshold against which we stub our toes? It's castration, baby. The second part of the argument is as simple as the first. This matheme, known as the analytic discourse that is structured around a certain impasse, indeed, like all of Lacan's mathemes, it is written using mathematical symbols. That's what you see in the drawing of the analytic discourse, a series of mathematical symbols. S1 is a mathematical symbol. S2 is a mathematical symbol. That delta between them, a mathematical symbol. We could just keep going here. This matheme, like all of Lacan's mathemes, are written using mathematical symbols. And what, I ask, is mathematics for Lacan? Mathematical language for Lacan is the furthest you can go with language. It brings you right to the castrative edge of a void we call the real. In mathematics, we can formulate this edge, what you just heard me call a threshold. It is a castrative edge of a void we call the real. And mathematics is the furthest we can go with language to formulate this entity, this event, this edge. And what do we know about language? Language, as you know, is the elemental structure of the symbolic. Second only, I would say, in its warp and woof, to Lacan. So, you just heard me say, access to the real, or at least access to its point of access, from the imaginary by way of the symbolic. And the analytic discourse is this way. It is this means. It is this trail map that tells us how. Yes, don't get it twisted. Analytic discourse traffics in the imaginary. Indeed. Yes, don't get this twisted either. It definitely steers us toward the real and by way of the imaginary. There's that line of inquiry again. But pay careful attention to this. The analytic discourse, however, in its mathematical form, in its written mathematical form, it is fundamentally symbolic. Yes, it traffics in the imaginary. Yes, it steers us towards the real. But its written mathematical form remains symbolic. Even if it brings us to the edge of the symbolic, the analytic discourse remains within the bounds of symbolicity. Now, there's no news there, so why am I hammering on this point? Because I think it allows us to see with precise clarity what Lacan is up to in chapters 4 to 6 of Seminar 21. In analytic discourse, we realize that every Hallmark card is full of accidental love letters, in which our attempt to cover up the sexual is written, and thus, even if only on second glance, legible. Indeed, these aren't the love letters we considered in our last lecture. These accidental love letters are not the same as those whose meaning is so fleeting, causing us to send one more Hallmark card after the other. Notice what I'm doing here. On first glance, the Hallmark card, especially when love is on the line, it reads as a narcissistic love letter, the latest and greatest in a series of fantastical promises that there is truly, I swear, a sexual relationship to be achieved, maintained, and so on. But on second glance, however, when we zoom in on the signifiers that carry this fleeting meaning, what do we see? We see letters, one right after the other. Letters as in letters in the alphabet, one right after the other, clustered together in little assemblages. What is the signifier? It is an assemblage of letters. And in each of these letters, guess what we also see? Another assemblage. An assemblage of overlapping strokes, furrows, ink-filled indentations on a thin material made of pressed plant fibers, wood pulp, and the like. Zoom in on any signifier, on any word, and you'll see letters. Zoom in on those letters, and you'll see yet another assemblage. Here, an assemblage of strokes. How are we, as good Lacanians, and maybe even good dupes every now and again, to understand these assemblages of letters that are themselves assemblages of strokes? We are to understand them as little piles, petita. Which is why Lacan is toying with l'amour. And my French isn't probably good enough to capture this. L'amour, the word for love is also the word, as Lacan hears it, le mur, for the wall. He's been messing with this since Seminar 19A, the psychoanalyst knowledge. Why is he toying with this in these chapters here in Seminar 21, and thus recalling his earlier work on walls in relation to love? Why is he messing with the la-la-lang-tastic homophony between these two words, love and the wall? Love letters revealed to be little piles. Little piles of what again? Strokes, slashes, bars, barriers. Indeed, these are walls, each imposing a certain limit on narcissistic love. And that's the key part here, really. Narcissistic love wants to believe that the oneness it hopes to achieve will be without limit, without edge, and thus without void. All of these patita, these little piles of letters, of strokes, these function as walls by which Lacan means limits. Notice what he's up to. Page 92 of Seminar 21, or at least the packet that we're working with, the English translation of Seminar 21. Notice he still has the analytic discourse in mind. If psychoanalysis is a means, he says, it holds itself at the place of love. It is the imaginary of the beautiful that it has to affront. And it is to open up a path of a reflowering of love insofar as l'amour, and you can see it on the page exactly how he spells it, as I said one day, writing the little a object in brackets plus the word mur, since l'amour is what limits it. This is one of those where you might just want to go find this passage and see how it's written. L, A in parens next to the word M-U-R is how he's toying with this once again. I think this is, although a little squirrely, a terrific account of analytic discourse. The analytic discourse, that math theme we've been discussing for a while now. What is it? It's a means of opening up a path toward a reflowering of love, as Lacan puts it here. From imaginary love letters to abject little piles of real letters. Here, I think, is that second glance we're after. A second glance at narcissistic love that allows us to read in it, especially with our ears, mind you, a potential reflowering of love, away from the imaginary and toward the real. And lest you think that little a in brackets next to the word mirror, meaning wall, is object little a as the cause of someone's desire, Lacan returns to this theme a few pages later in Seminar 21. What remains of narcissistic love when we rediscover l'amour at its foundation, spelled L, A in parens, next to M-U-R. What remains of narcissistic love when we rediscover it like this? Lacan is explicit, and just a few pages from where I just read for you. 96 is where we land. What remains of it, he says, I articulated since this almost infinite time for me that I have been repeating myself, namely, the letter d'amour, insofar as, in fact, it constitutes nothing other than a pile, a little pile a petit a of habits and nothing more. You heard it from Lacan in television. Here we have it again, and I want to be crystal clear on this point. The little a in brackets that is up against that mur, that wall in L'amour, as Lacan is writing it here, is not object little a, but abject little a. What Lacan in television says is the abject that I have come to call my object petit a. Here, of course, he's playing on the homonymy of petit a and petita, meaning little pile. Just as he did in television, so he is also doing here in Seminar 21. If you're curious about this, go back to our series on television. We work it all out there. The key theme here is abjection. That is not object little a. That is abject little a. And by petit a, he means petita, little pile. It's a little abject pile. That's what you see. When you zoom in on signifiers, you see little piles of letters. And when you zoom in on letters, you see little abject piles of strokes, of marks. Petita, little pile. In the final analysis, love, for Lacan, like writing itself, it's just a little abject pile of marks, strokes, cuts, fissures, furrows, creases, cracks, and if you know your beloved as well as I know mine, wrinkles as well. Can we string all this together before I fully go off the deep end here? Let's see if we can give it a try. In the meaning of love, we find little piles of signifiers. In these little piles of signifiers, we find little piles of letters. And in these little piles of letters, we find little piles of what can only be described as strokes. From signifieds, there's your meaning, to signifiers, to letters, to strokes of pen on paper. This is how real letters of love circulate through imaginary love letters in analytic experience. And it is the job of analytic discourse, the analytic discourse, to read the former in and out of the latter. This is what Lacan means at the start of chapter 5 in Seminar 21, when he says the analytic discourse functions as a decantation of meaning. It's a terrific passage just below the one you heard me read. What does decantation mean on this occasion, he asks. It is properly, and this is why the metaphor of decanting can be sustained here. It is properly about the condensation of what, in terms of meaning, is concentrated by this discourse, from the fact that meaning, the meaning of words, are only a garb for what we will call, if you don't mind, nothing more than the sexual coitus. This is what is new in analytic discourse, Lacan concludes. Ho, ho, ho. Decantation. Well, hold on a minute. What are we talking about here? Which part's liquid and which part's solid? Where's that fine wine? And where do I put the leftover sediment? Which is which? Which is the Hallmark card? emptied of impossibility. And which is the analytic letter of love in which this evacuation is written? Which one is liquid and which one is solid? Which one is fine wine and which one is leftover sediment? In some sense, you can guess. In another, broader sense, it doesn't fucking matter, at least for our purposes here. What's crucial here is neither liquid nor solid, wine nor sediment, but the apparatus by which they can both be studied, together and occasionally apart, typically one inside the other, without either slipping into oblivion. What is this apparatus? It is the analytic discourse. The analytic discourse is the apparatus by which we can study analytic letters of love within Hallmark cards emptied of impossibility. The analytic discourse is this apparatus in and by which imaginary and real love letters alike are written, signed, delivered, and crucially read, typically with our eyes, but if you've got a good analyst, with ears as well. But again, it's writing that Lacan has in mind here. So let's stay focused on this medial aspect of his argument for just a minute longer. Unfortunately, though, it's a minute that's longer than we have time to do with this lecture. This is precisely where we're going to turn next in our reading of Seminar 21, to this medial aspect of his argument, the centerpiece of which is writing. We are, after all, talking about love letters here.